Counter-Technique of Elegance, looking to Jacques Ellul for a sane response to modernity. This is kind of I would say maybe a continuation of different themes that we've been touching on and learning about together for much of the past 6 months. I think perhaps maybe to explain a little bit my own interest in this, I took a course last year on the thought of Marshall McLuhan, who was one of the original uh, I guess you could say founders of what's known as media ecology, which is a essentially a critique of how different media or technologies or tools affect humanity. And this was for me kind of an eye-opening experience because um, as a person who worked in the world of development for a long time, I kind of assumed, as most of us in the modern world do, that technology is a force for good, right? That technology is unequivocally and with very little critique towards how technology operates, we tend to think that technologies are beneficial. Obviously, we talk about some of the negative aspects of technologies, but as a general principle, as a general thing in society, we tend to believe that technology is a very positive thing. It moves us forward. It's an essential element of progress. And when I started to interact with the thought of Marshall McLuhan and then Ivan Illich, Jacques Ellul, Walter Ong, there's a whole suite of thinkers that really began to emerge in the middle part of the 20th century. I think that's meaningful that this happened in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. There was this backlash to the explosion of technological innovation that was occurring at that time. Um, and I really started to think, what is the relationship between development as a practice and the technologies that we rely on, that we push, that we try to bring into the communities where we work. And I think before we can really have a critique of how those technologies can be beneficial or uh, uh, damaging to a community, it's important to understand what is our relationship to technology? And we've talked about that in the past. We've talked about the difference between technological adoption versus appropriate technology. And we've looked at some of the thought of Marshall McLuhan in a past class. And I've mentioned several times in different classes Jacques Ellul, who was a French philosopher, academic, thinker, theologian, who was writing about the same time as all of these other people. And he wrote a very, very persuasive critique of technology. And so I wanted to kind of use his thought today to try and continue this critique of what technology is, how we orient our lives to it, and what are the implications to this, to how we conceive development. And I hope, I know sometimes it might be difficult to make that connection between development work and how we orient our lives towards technology, but I think that that's fundamentally important. So the summary of class today is I want to start by looking briefly at who was Jacques Ellul, give a brief introduction, biographical introduction to who he was, and some of the main tenets of his thought, of his kind of intellectual journey. And then the main kind of theme that brings together, he wrote 60 different books. He was very prolific as a writer. But one theme that he kept coming back to, that kept popping up in all of his writings, was this idea of technique. And as a French person, he wrote all of his books obviously in French. And the etymological uh, meaning of technique in French has a vastly different and broader meaning than what we tend to think of technique in the English version, right? So a lot of times the book that he wrote was called his most famous book was called La Technique in French, and that was translated in English as the Technological Society. But in every one of the different books that he's written, there's always a long translator's note at the beginning of the book that tries to spell out what Ellul was trying to explain about this idea of technique. And so I want to, before we get into what his thought, I think it's important to try and understand what he means by this idea of technique, because he makes the argument that all of modernity, modern society, is oriented uh, around this idea of technique. And so we have to try and kind of pull that apart and dig into what he really means by that. And then look at, what happens to the world in which we live when the defining property, the catalyst, the motor that drives all of our decision making is what he calls technique. And so we're going to turn to Aldous Huxley, who was a novelist, who is a contemporary of Jacques Ellul, and who wrote his most famous book was called Brave New World, who was it was a dystopian novel, kind of depicting a dystopian future, but one that was very, very different from many of the other novelists and other writers who were writing these kind of dystopic novels about what the future might entail. These not necessarily science fiction, but these forward-thinking kind of doomsday predictions of the path that humanity was following. And Aldous Huxley in The Brave New World kind of follows a lot of the assumptions that Jacques Ellul makes, and they kind of play off of each other. So I want to kind of try and look at some of the predictions that Aldous Huxley had made in his book Brave New World, and how they fit in with Jacques Ellul's meaning of technique. And then lastly, Jacques Ellul said very, very little in his life and in his writing about what are some of the practical things, tangible things that people can do to go against this current of technique, this domination of our society by technology. And he did say some things, but he said very little about what we could do to try and avoid that, to change that, right? So I want to try and use some of the things that he said, but also some other thinkers who were contemporaries of Ellul as well. And then lastly, stemming from the title, the counter technique of elegance. Um, there's another thinker that I've referred to in several past classes called David Fleming, who has this idea that he calls elegance. And elegance is kind of this idea of a counter technique, of taking back control over our technologies and using them for proper purposes. So I want to try and take a look at that as well, as we end up the class. So let's go ahead and start. I'll try and leave 15 or 20 minutes at the end for questions and comments from you all. But yeah, who is Jacques Ellul? This is a picture of him. He was a French philosopher, a sociologist. He converted to Catholicism around midway through his life, and a professor who died in 1994. He published over 60 books in his lifetime. All of them were written in French. He was from France. But the dominant theme of Ellul's work was the threat to human freedom that he believed was created by modern technology. So right away we kind of get this paradox, or this the antithesis of what most of us think of as technology. So most people think that technology increases human freedom, right? That the more technologies we have, the more comforts we're given, the more possibilities we have. The technologies that we have today allow us to pick up a computer and have an internet connection, and we can connect with people on every side of the world. We are vastly more communicated. If you have a little bit of savings, you can hop on an airplane and fly, uh, you know, 30,000 feet in the air from one side of the world to the next. We have an enormous amount of energy at our disposal, and that energy has been turned into an enormous array of technological gadgets that, in theory, make our lives better, make our lives more progressive, and in theory, increase human freedom. Human freedom, human autonomy. What Ellul says at the very beginning is that no, that the amount and the scope of our technologies has reached a point that it is overshadowing human freedom, right? He wasn't anti-technological. We use a lot of times this kind of dichotomy that you're either that technology is something that you're either for or against, right? And Ellul was not either for or against. He understood that technology was, a part of human striving. So he didn't seek to eliminate all modern technologies or techniques, but he sought to change our perception of modern technology and technique to that of a tool rather than that as he wanted us to consider technology as a tool, something that we could use, something that we could manipulate, something that was under our control, that was under the autonomy of human decision, and not as something that regulated the status quo of society. And his critique, as we'll see as we move along, was that technology following this idea of technique had become our master, right? We created the tool for our own uses. And as the tool and the technologies grew more pervasive and stronger, humanity eventually had to change our lives, change our thoughts, change the way that we inhabited the world to fit the technologies that we created. And he saw this as one of the greatest threats to human freedom and to human well-being, to the future, right, of humanity and the world itself. La Technique. This is a picture of the original book, written in French. La Technique, l'enjeu du siècle, which means the challenge, technique, the challenge of our century. So his most famous book, titled La Technique, was translated in English as The Technological Society. And he asked us when the first translation in English came out, he specifically asked that it not be word for word translated as technique, because he thought that the English word of technique didn't really explain what he was trying to get at with the French term. So he was adamant that the idea of technique transcended the limited meaning of the English word technology. For Ellul, one of the problems that arises when we try to critique the idea of technology is that the English word tends to point only towards objects, artifacts, and tools, right? So when we think of the word technology, what is technology? We probably think of a computer or a cell phone. If we say technology of transportation, we might think of an airplane or an automobile. If we think of technology of communication, the phone, the computer, all of these different things, right? Technologies of industry, we think of different machines, robotics, etc. And technology in this sense is the physical thing, right? The thing that we can hold, that we can have in our hands, that we use. And Ellul considered that this definition was dangerously limited, right? Because it shrouded from our sight and from our understanding all of the deeper implications of the tools and the artifacts that were coming to dominate how society functioned and how society was organized. Basically, he thought that when we limit the idea of technology to something that exists physically in the world, it kind of takes on this ambiance that it is something that we control, right? A tool is something that we use. And it brings up this idea that the human has autonomous control over the technology. But when in French, the idea of technique implies a deeper sense of it's not just the tool, but it's also all of the different uses and how those uses interact on a sociological level, on economic levels, on political and governance structures, on how cultures are transformed and how human society adapts to the implications of how a certain tool, how a physical thing is used, and how that thing transforms the society. If any of you all were present in the class that we shared a couple months ago about the work of Marshall McLuhan, a Canadian author and academic, he said the same thing. Yeah, his famous way of saying that was the medium is the message, right? That it's not how we use a tool, right? It's the very fact that we use it changes our perception of reality, changes how we orient ourselves. So for the famous example is the cell phone, right? A lot of parents of younger children, myself included, we try to say, well, the cell phone or the tablet or the screen, is a tool that if we use it rightly can be beneficial in the education of our children. So we have screen time. There's parental controls on how many hours they can be on the screen, how what content they can use and see. And those are things that are obviously important and beneficial. But what McLuhan and what Ellul says is that more important than how you use the tool is how the tool changes your perspective and our interaction with reality, right? The moment that the cell phone came into existence and began to perpetuate itself, that fundamentally changed how humans interact. It changed, the face-to-face interaction that used to dominate society. When screens began to intermediate things, this was a fundamental shift, a sociological shift, a communicative shift, right? What Elul was trying to say is that we can't just think of, let's say, a cell phone as a tool, something that we use. We have to think of it in a wider sense of all of the different changes, all of the different structural shifts that tool requires, right? Technique in the English language, as from I pulled this from the dictionary. It says technique is a way of carrying out a particular task, a skillful or efficient way of doing or achieving something. And I want to draw our attention to this idea of efficiency, because for Elo, one of the things that he was very critical of was this idea that all of the technologies that were becoming so pervasive in society, the general direction of technological development was focused on efficiency. This idea that everything had to be faster, quicker, more efficient, more optimized for profit, more optimized for industrial growth, more optimized for profit making. This idea of efficiency in a very capitalist sense was kind of the ethos that guided all of our technological development. So by technique, Elul means much more than machine technology, right? He's not just talking about the thing in itself. Technique for him refers to any complex of standardized means for attaining a predetermined result. Thus, it converts spontaneous and unreflective behavior into behavior that is deliberate and rationalized, right? When we submit ourselves to this idea of overwhelming efficiency, that everything we do, everything we use, all of the way that we orient our lives, how we communicate with people, what work we choose to do, all of these things are oriented by efficiency. It's not this spontaneous human reaction to a natural reality. It's trying to fit ourselves into a system that is technologically determined, right? So technique, according to Lowell, this is a quote from his book. Technique now constitutes a fabric of its own, replacing nature. Technique is the complex and complete milieu, and this term was very important for him. Obviously, it has a French origin, etymological origin. And this idea of milieu is kind of like habitat or ecosystem. A new artificial creation that was created by this technological drive towards efficiency, right? Is what was being created, right? So technique is the complex and complete milieu or habitat or ecosystem in which human beings now must live, and in relation to which they must define themselves. It is a universal mediator, producing a generalized mediation, totalizing and aspiring to totality, right? This idea that everything we do is oriented towards maximizing efficiency, maximizing or optimizing ourselves, in this world of growth, this world of profit accumulation, this world of increased technological complexity, etc. Right? Another quote from his book. is technique has taken over the whole of civilization. Death, procreation, birth, all submit to technical efficiency and systematization, right? This idea that, we're born in these birth wards, in hospitals where, doctors and midwives no longer respond to an individual pregnancy, right? How a child is brought into the world is determined by the statistics of what techniques for birth delivery are more efficient. So giving the epidural as a standard procedure, which is something that happens even though the family might not want that. All of these different things, it's kind of like a machine birth type of thing. It's something that's done because that's what is considered to be safest by the numbers, right? By the calculations of this efficiency machine. And all throughout our lives, we are put into schools that are oriented towards the most efficient pathway towards learning. Not the most interesting, not the most individualized, but whatever is most efficient. Then we move into the world of work, where we try to choose whatever line of work that is going to be more, that is going to allow us to optimize our abilities for the wider system, and all the way up until death, right? And today you have these, a lot of people kind of critique this. You have these uh, the loss of a space, a communal space where life is grieved, right? There are places now in the United States and Europe where when a family member dies, you call the number. And the mortician comes, will pick up the body for you from the hospital wherever it died, will take it, and they have like a optimized burial system where you can be done and over with it in 12 hours. I was going to try and find, there was actually, I saw a critique of this, kind of a meme that was, for a lot of this, this seems ridiculous, but this is kind of the orientation that this drive towards efficiency, has. So, in the critique of Ellul, modernity was guided by what he called a proceduralization, procedure oriented, whereby everything is organized and managed to function most efficiently and directed toward the most expedient end of the highest productivity, right? So the values that guide our technological system are efficiency, expediency, most productivity, right? Ellul's own comprehensive definition is found in the preface to his book, where he says, technique is the totality of methods rationally arrived at and having absolute efficiency in every field of human activity. Right. And the thing about rationality is important because the system creates its own rationality, right? There's a reason why a lot of people no longer want to sit with their dead, have the wake. Here in Latin America where I live, we still have, 2 to 3 day wakes where the family takes the corpse. A lot of times there's not any mortician or funeral service involved. People do it themselves. In my community, there's a local carpenter who still makes all of the caskets for the dead. Then the community comes together for 2, sometimes 3, sometimes 4 nights to celebrate that life, and then the whole community accompanies the family to the final burial. And many people in this efficient technological society, especially in the global north, will say, well, we simply don't have time for that, right? It's a, there's a logicality behind why you can hire somebody for an expedited 12-hour funeral, get it done and over with so you can get back to work, get back to life. And there's a logic, there's a rationality behind it, right? Given the totalitarian nature of technique, Ellul saw our civilization as fully committed to a quest for continually improved means to carelessly examined ends, right? So yeah, it might make sense that you want to bury your dead in 12 hours, but do we lose sight of what's important there? And that's where his critique of freedom comes in. There is something important about a grieving process during death. There is something obviously important about a community coming together to remember, the deceased, to accompany the family. And if we only care about the efficiency of the means, getting the dead put in the casket and in the ground as quickly and effortlessly as possible, what is lost in that process? And that's what Ellul asked us to think about, right? So, some of these ends or these means, he said, that tend to have us lose focus of what's really important, the ends that we should be striving for, is, unlimited economic growth. Even if GDP today is measuring misery, a lot of people critique when we only measure the health of our economies by GDP, we're not taking into account that, GDP also counts, how many people are incarcerated. Incarceration, especially when there's private jails, increases the GDP. How many people are suffering from cancer? Cancer is an extremely expensive disease. And the more people that have cancer, the more they're spending, the more the GDP grows, right? Another one is like more and faster cars, even if it takes us longer to get from point A to point B. So efficiency, technological efficiency would have us say we need to, improve our cars, improve gas mileage, improve how fast they go, improve the roads. But we really never stop to think that, the amount of time that the average person spends commuting to from their home to their work has drastically increased. We're going faster, but we're taking more time out of our lives for that, right? And the last one is more investment in healthcare, even as a society grows sicker and sicker. Um, so that was kind of Elul's idea, general idea of what this idea of technique kind of entailed and how it had kind of overtaken our control over the technologies we use. Technologies, again, for him, were no longer just the tools, but the whole system of how these two tools created a new artificial system into which humanity had to fit itself, right? It's this whole idea that we created the tools for our own use, and now we are subject to them. We are enslaved to them. Ellul, like other critics of technology of his time, was influenced by a lot of the dystopian and futuristic novels that were being written, especially, in the wake of the World War II, World War I, World War II. One that comes to mind is 1984 by George Orwell, and Brave New World by Aldous Huxley was also a very, very influential book. Um, Aldous Huxley, here's a few quotes from his book. One of the things that was interesting about Huxley's depiction about a future dystopia, a future kind of totalitarian state, was that it was not going to be brought about by a hard hand kind of dictator, right? This idea of a dictator who, if you don't obey what I say, I'm going to throw you in jail. I'm going to execute you, mass executions. This idea of hard-handed dictatorship. Huxley believed that people always rebel against that, and so the best way to create a system of control and compliance was through pleasure. Was through comforts, was through creating a sense of a society where people participated happily in their own oppression, right? And so here's a few quotes from Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. I'm going to return to this book at the end of the class here. But he said that most men and women will grow up to love their servitude and will never dream of revolution, right? So if we create this ethos that the technologies we use are for our own benefit, they give us more comforts, they give us more ease, they give us more ability to do things, to buy things, more consumer power. Then, because we assume that technologies are always beneficial to us, we're blinded to the negative aspects of the technological system in which we're living. We're blind to the fact that we have fundamentally changed so many different aspects of our lives. And one of the things that always strikes me, I live in a very rural area, and there's never any traffic. The few times we do get in the car, we go down to town and we might pass a few cars, maybe two or three cars on the road and 10 or 20 cattle. But we don't have traffic jams, right? And when I go into San Salvador, which is this massively disorganized city, and it just drives me crazy sitting in traffic jams for 2 or 3 hours. And then I look at people and they're happily in their cars, chatting, listening to music, talking on the phone. It is people have come to understand that this is normal, that it's normal for them in San Salvador, the city where the capital of the country where I live. There was a study done last year that the average commuter spends between 4 and 6 hours every day in traffic. That's just getting to work and coming home. And people have internalized that as normal, right? Because now they have the car. They think that the car gives them more mobility. They think it gives them more comfort. And it blinds them to the fact that it also enslaves them. It takes up to between 1/6 and 1/4 of their day. And people don't think about that, right? Um, so most men will grow up to never to love their servitude. You can say we are in servitude, in slavery to the mass transportation of individual cars, right? And we never question that, right? Another quote from Brave New World is that a really efficient totalitarian state would be one in which the all-powerful executive or political bosses and their army of managers control a population of slaves who do not have to be coerced because they love their servitude, right? This idea of force, of violence, of coercion through violent means never works. People always rebel against that again. And what Aldous Huxley said, and what Ellul also believed, is that because we technology gives us certain kind of stimuli and certain benefits, it blinds us to this kind of totalitarian system of efficiency that's being created. Another thinker, a modern thinker, more contemporary of today, is Paul Kingsnorth. Yeah, he's a great writer. He has a book coming out later this year called Against the Machine on the Unmaking of Humanity. It comes out, I think, in August of this year. I would recommend it to anyone. And he has in the preface, or the I guess the preview to this book, he talks a lot about the machine, kind of as another metaphor for this way of living wherein people are becoming more and more enslaved to technologies and to the efficiency that they demand, right? To the technique, as Jacques Ellul says. This is kind of a long quote. I'll try and read it here. It says, "We're living through some kind of earthquake. A global ecological breakdown, yes, also cultural disintegration, the rise of network technologies of control and surveillance, which have in their grip more and more, have us more every day. The powers of the world seem to be merging somehow: corporate power, state power, institutional power, ideological power, and the power of the oligarchs who built and control the internet. The power of the network itself. Some days it feels to me like we're living inside the plot of a piece of 20th century dystopian sci-fi, such as Brave New World, for example. This is the story of the machine," is what he calls it. "It feels like the story of a revolution, and I think its ultimate end game is the replacement of nature with technology, the rebuilding of the world in purely human shape, the better to fulfill the most ancient human dream, which is to become gods, which is what we all want to do. This machine rips up our roots in nature, in real cultures connected to time and place, and in our connection to the divine center, and in their stead, we are offered an endless consumer present, a present that is planned and monitored and controlled, a smart, borderless, profitable, but dead world that is increasingly detached from messy reality, directed by who even knows, mediated through screens. We're increasingly unable to escape our total absorption by this thing. We're reaching the point where its control over nature, both wild and human, is becoming unstoppable. It's developing its own theology as it takes us at warp speed into a new way of being human." So Kingsnorth, like Aldous Huxley, like Jacques Ellul, like Ivan Illich, has this idea that the machine, uh, uh, the suite of technologies that we adopt, in theory, exist to make life better, right? This whole idea of helping us to escape messy reality, right? We all want to move beyond, the supposed limitations of the past, right? The hardships, the misery, all of this idea that our grandparents and great grandparents lived lives of great degradation and deprivation. And so that technology is going to allow us to improve that, and to move beyond that. But Kingsnorth, like Ellul says, we need to think about what we're changing, right? Because as we adopt more of these technologies, as they become so pervasive in every aspect, every sphere of human livelihood, right? I mean, just think about the basics of life, right? The air that we breathe and that we live in is controlled. Most of us spend 90% of our time indoors, in these controlled environments where we have central heating and air conditioning. We never have to interact with what the real world is like outside. Most of us eat food that are grown in ways that are completely against natural systems, factory farms, industrial farming. Today, we're even moving away, trying to take food production away from the land and into synthetic laboratories where we can subsist on synthetic food. The water that we drink no longer comes from springs and rivers and lakes that are cared for, but rather by centralized water purification plants where in many cases, I just read somewhere in California where they're running out of water. Some municipality is now providing over 60% of its drinking water from recycled toilet flushes. And so that might be H2O, but it's not necessarily a relationship with the natural world, right? And so what Kings North says is that in this drive to maximum efficiency, it's rational and it's logical to try and exert human control over every aspect of the life in which we live. And that essentially means that we're creating what Ellul said, a new milieu, a new space, a new form of inhabiting the earth because the earth itself is different. And that requires of us certain changes. For example, it requires a person in San Salvador, a worker, to accept that 1/6 and 1/4 of their day should be spent in traffic, that's normal. It requires us to expect that food isn't something that we grow from the soil of life, but something that is provided by a corporation, packaged in plastic, made to look nothing like real food stuffs, right? Ivan Illich, another of my favorite thinkers, as you all will know, also, touches on this theme. He talked a lot about the threat of a completely artificial creation. This is a quote from his book, Tools for Conviviality. He says, "The reestablishment of an ecological balance depends on the ability of society to counteract massive material of values. Otherwise, man and woman will find themselves totally enclosed within his artificial creation, with no exit. Enveloped in a physical, social, and psychological milieu of his own making, he will be a prisoner in the shell of technology, unable to find again the ancient milieu to which he was adapted for hundreds of thousands of years. The ecological balance cannot be reestablished unless we recognize again that only persons have ends, and that only persons can work towards them. Machines only operate ruthlessly to reduce people to the role of impotent allies in their destructive progress." And Illich really gets to the heart of the matter, right? This idea that there is a space for technologies, but the moment that technologies begin to reshape the world in which we live, we've crossed a watershed. We've crossed a critical point, right? Wherein we've lost control of the technologies and we have to adapt ourselves, adapt our lives to this artificial creation, right? We will be prisoners in the shell of technology and we will have lost, all of this kind of um, evolutionary balance. Our ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years, who we are, the DNA that runs in our blood has been shaped by this process of evolving in a living world, right? And only in the past 100 or 200 years we've started to shift and extract ourselves from this world and put ourselves into this world of our own creation, right? And though we might think that that is for our own benefit, thinkers like Ellul and Paul Kingsnorth and Ivan Illich and Aldous Huxley beg us to stop and think about what's being lost, what is being changed, what are I like that Illich says here, the psychological milieu. What are some of the psychological changes that are happening in how we conceive of ourselves, of community, of the world, right? So how, kind of to end with, to leave some space, how do we stop this? How do we counteract this, right? If technique, this idea of maximizing efficiency and productivity is kind of taking over every aspect of politics, our culture, our economic milieu, right? All of this. What do we need to do? How do we extract ourselves from that, right? Again, Ellul didn't regard technology as inherently evil. He just recognized that it was a self-augmenting force that engineered the world on its terms, right? Thus, machines, whether mechanical or digital, aren't interested or can never be interested in truth, beauty, or justice. Just um, as Illich says here, if we're going to reestablish control of our tools, we have to understand that the tools in themselves can never have ends, right? We can never try to maximize for a tool, for a technology. We have to understand that tools and technologies, if they're going to be of any use, and if they're going to be under our control, we have to say that they operate for good quality human ends, right? Their goal must be the goal of machines is to make the world a more efficient place for more machines, not necessarily to make the world a better place for more humans. The proliferation of technologies and machines, combined with our growing dependence on their services, inevitably led to an erosion of human freedom and unintended consequences in every sphere of life. Technology, Lowell thought, can't put up with human values and must necessarily don mathematical vestments. I like that term, mathematical vestments. Everything in human life that does not lend itself to mathematical treatment must be excluded. Ellul thought. That's kind of what it said. If something isn't profitable, then we shouldn't do it. If it isn't efficient, we shouldn't do it. If it doesn't contribute to this entire new milieu of our own creating, then we shouldn't do it. A response to this technique, a counter technique, then begins with constructing a proper relationship to our tools. Wendell Berry is one of my favorite authors and a great poet, and he wrote a poem where the last line, or one of the last lines, is every day do something that does not compute, right? So he says, so friends, every day do something that won't compute. Give your approval to all that you cannot understand. Ask the questions that have no answers. Put your faith in the 2 inches of humus that will build under the trees every 1,000 years. Laugh, be joyful. You all the facts and practice resurrection, right? This idea of doing something that isn't going to make you more money, that isn't going to make your life run smoother, right? That might increase difficulty, that might increase hardship, that might make you sweat, that might be uncomfortable, things that might not necessarily, run according to the current of society, always looking for more efficiency. Walk instead of taking the bus. Spend some time burying your dead, even though you have a deadline at work, right? Do something that doesn't compute, something that isn't efficient, something that doesn't follow the maxims of technique, right? Ellul says also, what is at issue here is evaluating the danger of what might happen to our humanity in the present half century and distinguishing between what we want to keep and what we are ready to lose, between what we can welcome as legitimate human development and what we should reject with our last ounce of strength. What is the solution to technique according to Ellul? The solution is to simply view technique as objects. So again, going back to understand that tools, the moment that they try to restructure our reality, we should be we should question that, right? We should understand that a technology should be something that is useful to us, right? Recognize it for what it is, just another thing among others, instead of believing in technique for its own sake, right? If we do this, we can destroy the basis for the power that this technological milieu has over humanity. The first philosopher of technology, Ivan Illich writes a lot about him, was a little known monk of the 12th century named Hugh of St. Victor. Hugh of St. Victor believed that technologies were what he called a remedial activity, the idea of remediating something, right? He saw technology as a remedy for the bodily weakness that was the heritage of Adam and Eve's fall. And this modest view of technology as a remedial activity, as a remedy for our fallen nature, allowed him to set clear limits to its application. Technologies were only useful in helping us make our way back to Eden or back to that proper balance. Obviously there's some, I guess you could say, old school maybe the word is theologies in there, right? But the idea that technologies can be a remedy for our fallen nature in the sense of helping us to rebuild a proper balance. That's kind of what Illich and Ellul and other philosophers of technology think is where our hope lies, right? In regaining control over the technologies and extracting them from the system of maximizing the efficiency of the system itself, right? Given the tendency of modernity and its tools to orient towards efficiency, productivity, optimization, and ever greater control of the human made order over the natural order, what might a counter technique that situates technologies in their rightful place as remedies look like? And I'm going to say that there's three different ideas or kind of overriding themes of technology of a counter technique of technology. One, corporeality. Tools should be something that extend human capabilities but don't amputate human ability, right? The difference here between a hammer and a massive tool, most of the technologies we use today tend to amputate human ability in the sense that it takes over. It's not something that is an extension, whereas a hammer can be an extension of our hand. Most technologies end up kind of amputating our own abilities. Secondly, an embrace of hardship, right? Kind of in this idea of doing something that doesn't compute, right? Certain discomforts, difficulties, limitations, and hardships should not only be tolerated, but celebrated as part of the human condition where meaning is to be found. Technologies should not be blindly oriented towards defeating hardship, right? That's not to say that there aren't some uses of technologies to make things easier. Yes, but it can't be a blind pursuit of simply trying to erase anything that might be construed as hard, difficult, discomforting, right? Sometimes we need to accept those things, in our pursuit of a better life. And lastly, what Ivan Illich said, a convivial use of tools, right? If our relationship with technology is founded on a desire only to rid our lives of perceived hardship, to give ourselves up into a life of ease and comfort, efficiency and optimization for all the above, then the amputation-like effects of technology are to be expected. If, on the other hand, we see technologies as an aid in helping us to freely live our way into the embodied search for wisdom, then this binding of technology might yet redeem it, right? This idea of seeing technologies as a remedy for trying to live well in a world that is hard, right? Trying to live well in proper balance, upholding the human, upholding a sense of community, etc., right? Um, to end with, I want to kind of return. This is from the last chapter of Aldous Huxley's book, Brave New World. There's a wonderful dialogue. It's several pages long. I just extracted a few parts of it, but it's between the world controller, right? This kind of CEO guy who is kind of directing this mass efficiency technological system that people this dystopian future. And then there's one person who's known as the savage, a person who is by fate, kind of been living outside of the system, right? And there's a dialogue between the world controller and the savage, and they're trying to understand each other, right? And the world controller and the savage says, I see what you have. You have this very comfortable system where everything runs smoothly, et cetera, et cetera. But he says, I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin. In fact, said Mustafa Mond, who is the world controller, you're claiming the right to be unhappy. Well, all right then, said the savage defiantly. I'm claiming the right to be unhappy. Not to mention the right to grow old and ugly and impotent, the right to have syphilis and cancer, the right to have too little to eat, the right to be lousy, the right to live in constant apprehension of what may happen tomorrow, the right to catch typhoid, the right to be tortured by unspeakable pains of every kind. And there was a long silence. I claim them all, said the savage at last. Mustafa Man shrugged his shoulders. You're welcome, he said. I think, in that dialogue, we kind of come to the essence of how we are to exert control over our technologies again, right? And I think that the essence is claiming some of the difficulties, some of the inefficiencies that are natural to the human condition, right? In understanding that technologies can be a remedy, right? But only in so much that they are under our control, only in so much as they don't operate as ends in themselves, right? But as means to a better end, a human end, right? And for those of us who work in the world of development, before introducing any technology, any system into a place, I think it's really important to do a reflection, both ourselves and with the communities we work about this, right? About how technologies are going to shape that community, how it's going to change that, how this drive towards efficiency could be very detrimental to a community.